Hey everybody, how we doing? Go ahead and Craig is putting up a survey, so go ahead and fill that out. I'm really curious to see what the results are. If you check the box and at the very bottom there's a finished survey, then those votes will go through to the presenter. No React. Good point. Anyway, welcome to JS Remote Conf, day 2. Thanks for coming back. Hopefully you got a lot out of yesterday's sessions, and I'm really looking forward to today's sessions. Today we have Craig McKeachie. He's going to be talking about the anatomy of MV Star frameworks, and I'm really excited about this just to see what all of the pieces are and what he has to share with us. He's actually written a book on the topic, and I'm sure he'll tell you about that. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Craig and let him take it away. Craig, are you there?
I'm just need to turn on my audio and video. It looks maybe.
Yep.
There we go.
All right, I'm going to mute, and if you need me, just say my name.
Okay. Hi, everybody out there. Say hi in the chat room, please. Interesting results on the survey there. I wish I had more time. I would ask some more pertinent questions that included React. Yes, I hear about React every day. If I'm gonna get started in here. Everything sound okay? Anybody got feedback here right now? Have you hear me all right and everything? Yep, good. Okay. Let me get my presentation up and we'll get started. Okay. Someone in the chat here before I get going. Can everybody see the slide right now, or do I need to do something on this side? Good. Good. Okay. And I need to do something. That's good advice. All right, let's get started here. So I'm doing this kind of blind so that I can use the screen sharing in the slide. So I'll try to keep an eye out of the corner of my eye to make sure nothing's going wrong. So anatomy of a JavaScript MV framework, that's what this talk's going to be about. If you haven't used any of the frameworks, this talk will hopefully give you a foundation that should help you learn them significantly faster. If you know one framework but not all of them, hopefully this talk is designed to help you translate what you know into the other frameworks. Most importantly, though, it gives you a paradigm that when Angular 2.0 comes out, or the next version of Ember comes along, or something like React comes into our world, or whatever the next big thing is, you'll be better equipped to understand it. Okay. So you can see me on the screen there, but that's me and my kids. I gotta say, I usually don't dress matching my kids like that. That's just something that my wife requires of me once or twice annually. To take pictures with my kids. A little bit about me. So I've been a software developer for about 15 years, and I spent most of last year working on a book called the JavaScript Framework Guide that looks at AngularJS and Backbone and Ember, and that's where this talk comes from. So to start out, I just wanted to show you this little tweet I found about 6 months ago out on the internet. I'm sure the point of this is that you are not alone if you're having trouble keeping up with open source JavaScript innovation that's going on around you. Hopefully that's why you're here. But I think this is an exciting time as well for us, right? Where all this innovation is happening. It's kind of fun to be part of it, I think. Let's talk quickly about the inspiration for this talk. everybody, when I was doing the research for the book and working and so forth, everybody talks about why this framework is better or different, but nobody talks about how they are the same. And I had a similar experience to when I first learned to program.
Can I stop you real quick, Craig? There's a little bit of a delay in the screen share.
Okay.
So you're talking, and then the slide loads a minute later.
Wow. Huh.
I'm not sure exactly how to handle that.
That is unusual. So I'm going to switch the slide to the next one now, just as a little test. And do you see it yet?
See the slide that says inspiration.
They say that this should be real time. I wonder why that's so slow. That could be a big.
Oh, there we go. Disclaimer.
Right. I'm actually looking now. I actually have another computer running, so I can at least try to lag. I can see what's going on, so I can try to compensate for it. But thanks for telling me, Chuck. I appreciate it.
Yep.
Okay. So what I was saying was, when I was learning these frameworks, it was sort of like when I learned my first programming language. I had a similar experience where the first programming language, if you think back to when you learned it, it took a while for you to pick it up and a lot of hard work. But the second language was much faster, and eventually you could pick up new languages, at least at a cursory level, really quickly, because you started to sort of see through the matrix and realize that all of them have these common constructs like variables and loops and flow of control statements and operators and keywords. So what this talk is attempting to do is sort of take JavaScript MV Star or MVC frameworks and look at them in that same light and try to point out where those common constructs are, so that you can hopefully more quickly get to that point where you're seeing through the matrix. Quick disclaimer though, this talk is about similarities and not differences. So after this talk, you'll have a context or foundation to learn JavaScript MV Star frameworks faster, but it's kind of like the slide says, you will just know enough to be dangerous. So be warned of that. Okay. I'm going to start by taking a step back and looking at high-level web application architectures, looking at a bigger picture, but I promise to show plenty of code. And so we'll get there, right? So just be patient. I'm waiting for the next slide to come up. So when I'm talking about web application architectures, there are sort of two sides to this coin. There are traditional server-side web applications. So I've thrown up a bunch of technologies. Hopefully most people on this in this conference know. Rails, ASP.NET MVC, maybe Java Spring, this sort of stuff. These are the web, when I talk about server-side web applications, those are the kind of things you want to be thinking about in your head. And client-side web applications, you can see the list there accordingly. So on this first slide, what I'm showing you is what a basic server-side web application architecture looks like. And I know this is very cursory, but I think it helps when you really think at a high level about what's different in a single page web application or client-side web application versus this server side. So everybody knows this, but let's look at it really quickly. If we look at this HTTP request arrow or at the top there, what's happening? HTTP request is made, the templates and the data come together on the server. So that's the key point I want to make. So whatever your, whether it's Haml or you're in .NET and it's Razor or whatever your templating engine is, it's living on the server and it's getting the data out of the database and bringing your templates and the data together on the server when you're in a server-side web application. And with a client-side web application, or as the slide will show here in a second when it becomes available to you guys, I'm working with my delay here, so it's a single-page web application architecture. Wow, this is quite a delay. There we go. Okay, so in these single-page web application architectures, basically you get that initial HTTP request and an HTML page coming back over the wire there at the very top of the stack of arrows. But what's coming over the wire on that first request is like a shell page, a single, usually an index.html page, and we'll look at some examples of these in code. But you're getting this this basic shell of a page, kind of like a layout in Rails or a master page in ASP.NET. And you get this, and this page usually has some sort of div in the middle that has is sort of serves as a placeholder where you're going to place your other templates in. And then additional AJAX requests are made, or maybe just one. We'll talk about that later, to get the templates, so that the HTML templates come over the wire, and those templates in the middle of the diagram that are coming over the wire are, the key point here is that is just static HTML. In other words, there is no dynamic data that has been interspersed into them. They do have, places where dynamic data is supposed to go, but the data is not in them yet. And then there's an additional request, that's additional AJAX requests that are being made, which is at the very bottom of the slide there, out to a web API, and data is coming back over the wire, generally in JSON. And that data comes back over the wire and is married up. The templating engine, if you will, is inside of these frameworks on the client. So the data and the templates are brought together in the client, on the client. Okay, so I'm waiting for the next slide to come up, but it's about server-side MVC frameworks. So when we work with a server-side MVC frameworks like Rails or whatever, we could just build up a big string of HTML and return it on the server side, just in one method. But there's a reason that we have a framework on the server, and some of the services that help us generate that HTML and make the app easier to maintain include the ones listed here: a templates, a router, controllers, models. And I'm going to use these pieces to show you how these are kind of moving to the client side in the case of a single page application. So when the client side slide comes up for you in a second here, just waiting for the quick delay. So because the templating in the app is moving to the client side, that whole stack of things has moved to the client side. So a similar frameworks are needed on the client side. So instead of Rails, you've got Ember, right? So you need a similar framework that's helping you do that, build an application on the client side. So I'm going to go to my first demo here, and this will be challenging with this delay, but we'll let it pop up here. Maybe I'll even start playing it. Go. Okay. So hopefully at some point, yeah, there. Looks like it's coming up, and it should start running for you in a second. I hope. Yeah, okay, now there we go. Something's moving. So the simple demo that I put together to just show templates and routing basically in a single page application is the one you're seeing right now. And basically all it consists of, is it running? Come on. Give me a second here. There we go. Okay. So now it's running for you guys. So it's got a home and an about page, right? Not too eventful or exciting. And the home and about page just have an H2 that says home and an about. But I think when you get down to this really basic level, it's easier to see the pieces of the framework and how they work. So first, let's look at using this as an example. Notice how the hash changes from hash home to hash about. So we're just switching from a home to an about page. We've got hash home and hash about. Now, what is this? What I'm going to show you is what this looks like in each of these frameworks. So when the slides catch up here in a second, you'll see what this looks like in Angular. So the first thing you'll see is single page there. So this is the first piece of the framework we're going to look at. And it's not really an official part. It kind of falls under templates there. But this single page is that shell page you saw in the architectural diagram. It's this, you can see what it looks like in Angular here. It's, some basic HTML page with some script tags at the bottom to bring in the Angular framework. And then there's a div right in the center of the page there. And you'll notice that the div, that div is the equivalent of the placeholder that you saw in the architectural slide I showed you. So that is where the templates are going to be injected into that div. Okay, and that's basically what we're looking at, and it's an index.html page. pretty straightforward, okay? So what does this look like in Ember? And the slide will come up here in a second, but as you can guess, it looks very similar. Now you have a different set of scripts at the bottom, right? You have the Ember framework, you have handlebars, and you have jQuery, which are two dependencies of Ember. There you can see. But in the middle of the screen, you see that outlet tag. And so essentially, you serve an index.html page, and you've got an outlet there. So you've got this single page, which I like to call like a shell page, and it is where the other templates are going to be placed into in a JavaScript MVC framework. Okay. One thing you'll notice that's a little different about Ember is that it has the default template is not just kind of hanging out there in the index page. It's actually in its own application template in between those two script tags, if you notice right there. Okay. Now we're going to look at what this looks like in Backbone as soon as the slides update here. I'm having to stay ahead of myself and time it right. There we go. There we go. So again, looking very similar, right? It's just an index.html page. Backbone's a lot more flexible about, how you identify that div. In this case, I've just used an ID of content, but that ID of content is not magic. It could be a class of content. It could be a class of foo. I hate it when people use foo examples in there. I just did it, but you get the idea that because you're just basically using your jQuery skills with Backbone, which we'll see, you really don't have this need to care what you name that. You're just using a jQuery selector to grab it. Okay. I'm going to move on to the next section, which is templates and views. So once you've got this shell page down on the client, you've made that initial HTTP request, you need dynamic templates to be placed into that placeholder. And you saw that was an outlet. That placeholder is an outlet in Ember, and it's an ng view in Angular, right? But you've got these templates coming down. Okay. So this next section, we're going to be talking about templates. So what does a template look like in Angular? So a template at its simplest form is just a fragment of HTML, right? And there's basically two ways. On the right-hand side of the page, you see what you see in a lot of demos, which is, right in the index.html page, in other words, embedded in the page, you have script tags with a particular type, in this case, text equals ng template, right? And these can be included right there, but that's really mostly for demos, right? What you see more often is you see what external templates, as is shown on the left. So you can actually have a templates folder or a views folder, and you can put static HTML files in there and have those and these templates with Angular can work sort of out of the box without you doing any build step or whatever. They load asynchronously when they're used for the first time in the app. So if you go to the home page and then you go to the about page and then you go back to the home page, the about page, when you go back to the home page, there will not be another AJAX request for the home page's template again because you previously loaded it. If you want all those templates to be loaded sort of up front, then you use a task like a grunt or a gulp task like the one I'm showing here, grunt Angular templates, and you basically put you're basically putting the templates into a template cache, which is basically a dictionary that takes a key and then as the value, the contents of the HTML escaped. And in a second, you'll see some code there. It finally popped on the screen for me. All right. So next, we'll look at what does this look like in Ember? And it'll pop here in a second. I'm going to get a drink here in the midst because I've been going quite a while. So, again, be careful. I'm looking in the chat here real quick. We got to be careful to generalize, hey, all these are the same. But I think, this is extremely valuable for understanding frameworks. When you understand these pieces, basically, hopefully you can pick up, other frameworks, changes to the frameworks, evolutions to the framework rather quickly. And this is sort of, the aha moment I had after, working with these frameworks for a while. Okay, so Ember, right? Same thing, right? Inline script tags, right, in the page or in the index.html page, or you can have external templates. So, really sort of consistent. We're going to look at Backbone in a second here. I'm still working with the delay, so bear with me. So we've got, in Backbone, it's the same thing. It's text hyphen, template, just like it's text x hyphen handlebars in Ember, and you'll see that in a second. And there's the same sort of, ability to have these templates be preloaded when the app first loads up in a cache, or to have them, loaded by making AJAX request as you transition between pages. Okay. So there, it looks like you caught up to the Backbone view. You can see here we're using the grunt JST task because Backbone's really flexible. I mean, important point here is Backbone's really flexible about the templating engine it uses, and so switching those two lines at the bottom of the screen out is basically as complicated it is to switch from using the underscore templating engine to like a JST templating engine and being able to load templates externally. So next we're going to talk about the router, right? So now you've got this single page and you've got these fragments of HTML, and you need to be able to bring them together. You need to be able to tell the application that when I go to this URL that I want to load this template into that shell page, into that placeholder, okay? So what does that look like in Angular? I'm starting to be good at this timing, but not exactly right yet. Not exactly right.
Greg, I think we might have lost you. Hello? I'd give the rest of the talk, but I don't know what's in it, and I can't control the screen, so. Trying to see what options we have here. All right. Back here in a second. There we go. Craig, did we get you back?
We did. I'm really sorry about that, people. Both my connections set back up here so I can see the delay on the slides. Looks like it, unfortunately, is all my fault. My internet seems to be choppy tonight. I apologize. Here. So let me get my desktop shared again. Okay. And I can start back up the presentation. I got my audio, my video here. Let's see here. All right. The really good news is this appears to be real time now because I'm able to move my mouse around the screen and
Yes.
actually see things. So that's let's hope it sticks that way now. After that low outage, that would probably make us all a lot happier, right? If I wasn't talking about how the next slide's coming, I swear it is, right? So here we
Yeah,
go,
I'll
guys.
jump in if there is a delay, but go ahead.
All right, cool. So this is, just kind of resetting where we are. We're talking about the router, and we're talking about how do we marry up these fragments of HTML we have, these templates, with into that shell page we have. And so you basically configure it in your router in these frameworks. And here's what a configuration looks like in Angular. So you have a route provider, which is the configuration object in Angular, and you say, when I go to this path, I load this template. And when I go to this path, I load this template. And one thing some people wonder, they're like, well, but you said I could preload the templates. How does this router configuration change, when I'm preloading the templates? And the answer is it doesn't, because this template URL here is the key and into the $ template cache that you saw the code snippet of before, and the URL and the contents, it's just based off that key. So you request it again, it's just going to get it out of an in-memory JavaScript object. All right, so let's look at, that is a little bit of a delay here, it looks like. So I switched to the Ember router, so we're going to take a look at what that is. They're not too bad of a delay. With Ember, you'll notice really embraces the convention over configuration. So you see a lot less code here, but what's going on is there's a lot of assumptions being made. So as the comment there says, the left-hand side of it refers to the template, and the right-hand side is the path. It's able to be left off with the about route because it's convention. So it assumes that you're going to /about. In the case of home, I'm not going to /home, so I plugged in something different. There will be plunkers of all these demos. I know they're pretty simple, but I think they do help you kind of give you a nice basic demo of these little pieces of the frameworks. So looking at Backbone and what the router looks like in it, there's that routes hash up at the top, or routes object literal, and on the left-hand side are the paths, and on the right-hand side are the names of functions. And so that home route, for example, those first couple paths just called the home route. And in the home route, in Backbone, you're required to do something. And generally what you do is you instantiate a view, and you use your jQuery skills to just use a selector on that placeholder that's in your single page, your shell page, and you replace the inner HTML of that. Okay? And I've got demos of all these on Plunker, and I'll be glad to share the slides afterwards. I'm going to take a little break, although go a little quicker, for you guys to look at. I wanted to give you guys some tips as well. So here's a really good tip, right? This is how to hide important files, basically, that I found out on the internet. And I guarantee you no one is going to click on that folder if you just simply name it Internet Explorer. So it's a pretty straightforward thing. Okay, just wanted to give that quick tip in there. So next we're going to talk about controllers. Okay, and I'm going to jump ahead controller slide so we can catch up. Controllers is very similar, just builds on the last one. There's a home and an about page still. And you should see it here in a second, I hope. Please wait for the presenter to load his or her screen. Come on, show people this. So I'll describe what's going on while we're waiting. So basically, we got our home and our about page, but the about page, we've added some dynamic content because the controllers has, basically two jobs. Is the way I see things. Oh, there we go. You guys can finally see the glorious about page I have. It has some dynamic content in there, and that it's just simply a description of the page. So this is the about page. That little blurb there is the dynamic content. So in your controller, you're going to get some data, usually from a RESTful service. We'll get there, and you're make it available to your view in whatever way the framework does, or to your template in whatever way your framework requires you to do that. The other thing that controllers frequently handle is user interaction. So a common example of that is a click event. like a user's click event or a key press or this sort of thing. So what does this look like in Angular? So we'll see a slide here in a second when we catch up of what this looks like in Angular. The first thing you'll see at the top is an Angular.module definition. For those who haven't seen this before, this is basically like a package in Java for Java developers or a namespace for .NET guys. This is an organizational structure to keep your code, from floating out in the global namespace. So, I've established a module there, and we say .controller. We create a controller, which is basically a function. I'm passing it a $scope, and before chat room, who prefers controller as syntax in the chat room, and who's like me and having trouble warming up to it? I'd like to see a show of hands here. So to explain for people who are newer to Angular, the scope is basically the view model, and so we just assign whatever data we need to be available to the view in the view to the view model. In this case, we're just doing page.body text, right, to show it. There's some newer syntax in Angular in the last version or two, I think two actually, where there's a controller as syntax that makes basically scope be hidden in the framework and be available as the this object in JavaScript. So in those cases, a lot of people like the way the controllers read a lot better with that. So just know that, if you see examples in both ways, that's kind of what's going on at a high level. But again, let's focus on the controller and its two jobs. So the first job of the controller, again, is to get some dynamic data onto the screen to make it available to the view. And the second job is to handle those user interactions. In the case of Angular, just write off the scope. Anything you need to be available in the view, including that function to toggle details, needs to be available on the scope. Okay, so Ember, what does it look like in Ember? So Ember introduces this foreign concept to most people. You see that route object. Do not confuse this with the router that we talked about earlier. So the route object is different. It is the coordinating controller per my conversations with Tom Dale on my podcast.
Craig, if you can hear me, it looks like it kicked you off again. It looks like it's picking up sound from his end. Hello? Craig, can you hear me? All right, are you there, Craig?
I am.
All right. We have a few people wondering if this would go more smoothly if you turned off the video for
I'll
your
do
head.
that. I'd be glad to. I don't think anybody really wants to see my mug that badly. Here, I'll take a snapshot, just freeze myself here, I guess. Okay, we really didn't need to do that. Okay. All right. Done. So video's off.
Sorry about all the glitches, guys.
Okay. So in the chat room, or Chuck, everybody hear me all right now? No, we can see the presentation. See it over there. Yep. Okay, let's get rolling again. I'm sorry about that. So I'm going to repeat a little bit about the Ember route because I'm not sure where I got dropped off there, but I'll try to do it a little quicker. So in Ember, there's this new, they basically broken the controller's responsibilities into two areas. There's a route object, not to be confused with the router. It's a different thing. So it's a kind of controller, but since it's always tied to the route, to the URL, they chose to call it a route, but it's really a coordinating controller. And the about controller is a, see if I can remember this, a mediating controller. So again, the job of the route object is to, if you want to think at its basic level, is to load the model. The job of the other controller that you're more familiar with is to handle user state, user interactions, and to make data available, to the page. So when you set that model in this code example, make that model available in the about route, there are properties that are automatically sort of forwarded onto your about controller so that they're available in the view. So you see how it just says page.body text there. It's not, controller.about.route.page.body text. It's just sort of forwarded those properties onto the controller object, right? So it's just about taking the job of a controller and breaking it into two different areas. But this is a more confusing area of Ember. But a lot of people, as you get into more complex apps, look at this as a more robust, sort of sophisticated client-side framework. Okay. A couple other quick things to notice about the Ember example is, notice where the if helper there in the view lands. It need to be attached exactly to that paragraph object, which is kind of nice. You can do flow of control type things in the view without being attached to a DOM element, which is something that Angular is constrained by at times. But that's, I think, all we'll say since we lost a little bit of time there. The model. So next, we're going to look at Backbone. I'm waiting for it to load up. The Backbone controller we're going to look at is a view, right? And so this is very confusing. The object in Backbone that's the closest thing to this controller concept is called a view in Backbone. And a view in Backbone is really the object that is responsible for managing a DOM element and all of its children, okay? Which is very similar to what a controller is in Angular and the same concept in Ember. So let's just talk through this this view model real quickly in case you haven't seen one before. At the top there, you're establishing, loading up your template, but that's just a jQuery selector grabbing the about template based on an ID that's using an inline script tag in the page and saying, here's my about template, get the inner HTML for it. Let's compile basically this template using the underscore templating engine that's built into underscore. That's why it's underscore.template. There's an events hash there. And so that syntax reads, listen for the click event on the .detail. And the .detail is a selector. So if you look at the markup on the right side of the page, you have a button with the class of detail. So it says, look for elements with the class equal to .detail. And when the click event happens on them, call toggle details. And toggle details is a function right there in the view down at the bottom. And it's simply using your well-known jQuery powers to call toggle, the jQuery toggle function and hide or show something. So I have plunkers out there for all those controller demos, okay? And we're going to take another quick break to look at something I found on Twitter here in a second. The slides catch up. And I think, for a while there was a feeling of what, Ryan Bates is saying here. People were like, do we need another JavaScript framework? Why are there so many? I can't possibly keep up with this. But, right now, I think it's stabilized a bit. I mean, I think most people are using one of the three competitor, these three frameworks I'm talking about, plus a couple innovators, most notably React, which was mentioned, me leaving it off the survey before at the beginning. So definitely React's something you want to look at, but I wouldn't feel overwhelmed. I feel like people have sort of stabilized on these things. They'd always be looking for innovation, but if you want to get rid of some of the noise, I think it's okay to sort of focus on these three and React for now. I may get some hate for that, but if you're overwhelmed, I think it's a good place to start anyway. My next demo I'm going to show is the classic data binding example. You should see it come up here pretty soon, but I think most people are familiar and have seen it. It's basically, you have an input, you type some content into it, and you see it in real time being bound back to the view there. So one thing I'll say about data binding in this data binding section is that data binding is something you didn't see in that server-side stack, right? When I was showing you the Rails and the ASP.NET MVC and the Java Spring server-side, rendering of HTML type frameworks, you don't see data binding, and the reason you don't is because basically it's not a stateful application on the server when you think about it, right? We all know that. But on the client side, this single page is going to hang around for quite some time in many cases, and so it's very stateful. It's more like a rich client, a desktop application, a native application. Okay. So what is this example? How do you pull this data binding off, this two-way data binding off in Angular? And the answer is, very simply with this code that's probably famous to most people by now because of its simplicity and then all it's achieving. But at the end of the day, the nuance here is that it's doing two-way data binding. So one-way data binding, the way I like to talk about and think about it, is from the view, from the model to the view. And that's the kind of data binding that you pretty much absolutely have to have, and you even have in your server-side frameworks. But the binding from the view back to the model automatically is something that you don't necessarily get on the server side, okay? And what does this look like in Ember? So now we switch to that same example in Ember, and I wish I could switch back and forth so you could see the nuance, but basically the angle brackets that were around the input tag are missing in this Ember example. And this points out, one key, difference is that, Angular with the handlebars engine, there is now HTML bars available for Ember, which is a replacement library for handlebars. But to not go into that, you can see that this is what, I'm sorry, I hit the mic there. Apologize for anybody whose ears just broke. These input helpers in Ember, I had trouble warming up them as much as the Angular code, because I like the Angular code how it reads more like you're just writing HTML, right? And when you draw to these things now, like Tom Dale from the Ember team would say, he prefers this syntax because he feels like it stands out in your template better. And so I think there's arguments on both sides of that, but do notice that that it is different. So how does Ember know to data bind that value equals name? Basically because there's no quotes around the name property. Right? That's the difference. Okay. Let's looking at this in Backbone, and before people think I'm not doing Backbone justice, I'm going to tell both sides of this story. And it's a lot more code to do two-way data binding, at least manually in Backbone. But a couple caveats. Hopefully the code will come up here pretty soon. A couple caveats are, Backbone does not have this as a feature. They purposely do not have this as a feature. They just have the one-way data binding, right? There are plugins that allow you to have two-way data binding Backbone if you choose. And another caveat would be, it's not as often as you think that the binding from the view to the model is useful. Obviously, binding from the model to the view is kind of integral to building a web app, but binding from the view to the model can be useful, but it's not as frequent where you're like, oh my gosh, I'm missing that. The other thing to note is, there's this sort of automatic watching that Angular does to do the data binding, and the same sort of the observable pattern in Ember does have a performance impact. And if you don't need things to be, with Backbone, you really are in control of exactly what you're doing at a very low level. And so a lot of people who need fine-grained control, like for mobile apps and mobile devices, and have performance concerns, sort of lean towards that low-level control that Backbone gives you. And I have data binding demos as well, and these are just to keep you on your toes or in JS Fiddle. Okay, and we have JavaScript. Here's yet another thing I found out on Twitter. You may have seen this one before when it pops up. And the next section we're going to talk about is models. So yeah, here's something else I found out on Twitter. You may have seen this one, but it's also appreciated by me. So if you can't read the book titles there, it's JavaScript, the good parts on the left, and JavaScript's David Flanagan's The Definitive Guide on the right. And I think it speaks for itself, right? So when we talk about models, we'll see the demo here in a second. So models are, your business objects, your entities, your data for your application that you're using to define your business case. The demo I'm showing for this is it created a person object, and when I click a change name property, I'm changing the name on it, and I'm using the abilities of the frameworks. All have some sort of one of the key pieces they have on the model is this ability to do dirty checking. I'm sorry, not dirty checking, but like watch for changes, basically. Okay. So we'll see in a second what this looks like in Angular. So in Angular, a model is basically some sort of service. So you might do a .service or a .factory or a .entity, but at the end of the day, it's some sort of service, which is an overloaded term in Angular. I won't go deep into that, but so what you get, this is how you'd pull off, creating a person object with a name property in Angular. You notice, a couple questions. Why would you bother, writing that code and not just writing a function, a constructor function yourself, to create your person object? And a couple benefits you get. One is, because you're inside Angular's module there, you're keeping things out of the global namespace. Another reason is, you basically wired things up into the dependency injection framework. So that person object is then available to be injected in the controller. So if you look below in the .controller, it's being passed in as .person, and the dependency injection framework inside Angular will automatically give you that object. I've got a change name function there on the scope that's being called when you click that button on the UI, and that changes the name. And then the interesting part is that you can basically watch any property on a model object in Angular and get access to the old values and the new values. Next, we'll look at what that looks like in Ember. And it's very similar. Ember has an ember.object.extend. I could have done this example in Ember when it pops up here in a second. I could have done this example, much more like the Angular example, but I chose to do sort of the listening or the observing inside the person object in this case. I thought it read a little bit better. So you basically say, the key part there is looking at that name changed function, calling .observes on it. And on .observes, you simply say what property you want to observe, and it will notify you of changes and call that name changed function. We're going to look, take a second, get a drink here, and next we'll pop into Backbone and what models look like in Backbone. And Backbone was really the first framework and the originator of this model concept. In fact, one of the key things, Backbone's sort of weak on the view layer. I guess I can say that, and weak in other areas, but very strong in its model implementation, I think. So taking a look at this code, basically you set some defaults, you establish what properties are on your model there. There's a name change property. I mean, you can read the code. Trying to think what the highlights here are. One thing to notice in both the Ember and the Backbone example is the getters and setters, right? So the getters and setters are there because, it's doing an observable pattern, whereas in Angular, as you may have heard about, there's this dirty checking going on where basically it's, watching for network events or watching for timeouts or watching for browser user interaction type events like a click or key press, this sort of thing, and sort of doing dirty checking throughout all the bound values on the page. Whereas in Backbone and Ember, their implementation is more of an observable pattern, so you also always have to call set properties and get properties through a getter and the get and the set methods. But then this allows them to sort of hook in there and know when things are being changed, and you can see how that's implemented here. So I mean, another key point of this slide is in the initialize in the middle of the person object there, where you say, I'm listening for the change event on the name property of this, and I'm going to call this function the name changed function when that property changes. And I've got demos for those as well. It looks like we're running kind of long on time because some of the technical difficulties. Chuck, do you want to? I'm going to rifle through these end slides if that makes sense. I'm thinking. Try to get to the key point. We can pass them out afterwards. You want to chime in there, Chuck?
Yeah. Why don't you? Or how much longer do you think you're gonna need?
I've got about 10 slides left. We got to go over web components and data access in each framework, and then I'm pretty wrapped up. So I'd say probably about 5 to 10 minutes left.
All right.
But I could cut it down to 3. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
Why don't we go ahead and try and do it in 3 to 5 minutes, and then we might wind up starting the next talk a minute or two late, but we'll just deal with that.
Okay, cool. So the next piece you want to think about with these frameworks that they're giving you is this ability to create custom tags or widgets. Think jQuery plugins, but based on web standards and better encapsulated. So this is the same as webcomponents.org, right? Polymer and stuff. This is the idea that you can own your HTML and make your own DSL on top of HTML to describe your application and its logic. Okay, and we'll look at just the simplest example in each of these frameworks. Angular's will come up first. I'll leave it up there for a few seconds, give myself like 10 seconds on each one, then Ember, and then Backbone. That should help me get through a little faster. So with Angular, what we're doing there is just writing a template that outputs hello, hi there, and these components can get significantly more complicated with Angular, but the concept is there in all of the frameworks. I think with Backbone in particular, when you look at this last example, the closest thing to a web component is a small view. And some people might be okay with that, but it's not really a first-class citizen in the framework, so it's just something to be noted. But there is this idea that you'd be able to, sort of have components in your application, and Angular's directives take that, significantly further. As they've mentioned in the next version of the framework, they're looking at sort of breaking directives into 3 concepts: components, as we've seen here, as well as sort of structural directives and decorator directives, which serve different purposes. So it's directives are a little more powerful and broad in Angular, but they also have a more complicated API accordingly. So looking at data access for these frameworks. So the simple example I'm going to do is just load some employees from a JSON file just to give you a feel of what it's like. So in Angular, basically you've got the $HTTP object. This is very similar, but not a wrapper around. I've said that before incorrectly, to jQuery's $.AJAX. And basically what you're doing is, you're making a raw AJAX request. It supports promises. The other thing to mention about Angular is they also have $resource, right? And $resource is basically a more terse way if you know your API is RESTful and not just a unrestful service behind there. You can use $resource and have a lot more terse code when you're calling out to make data access calls. In Ember, lots of projects, including Discourse, which is, I think, the forum software used for this conference, which is probably the most famous open source project using Ember. In that project, they just basically use jQuery like I'm showing here. There is a sort of sister project that's on the Ember.js site called Ember Data. That's much more ambitious in terms of data access. And it's more like an ORM, like Active Record in Rails, more of a full-blown ORM. Okay. In Backbone, if you do a data access, it's sort of encapsulated right into the model, but they have this idea of, talking to RESTful services is sort of the default. So if you, in this example, if you left that on the employees collection, if you left that URL off, it would just assume that you're going to call out to slash, employees when you're with a get, when you're getting data. If you need, if you have an ugly URL like I did in my Plunker example, you can override the URL property and say, you need to go to the specific location to get this data. But at the end of the day, so it sort of supports those two pieces that Angular does. It just does it in, a little bit more tightly coupled to the model object, and yeah, it's more of an override here on the URL to get somewhere. Okay, so to wrap up, let me say this: these frameworks are all, a lot of people talk about the differences in these frameworks, but I think it's important to remember that they all are solving the same problem. And hopefully you're starting to see these commonalities in these frameworks and these common framework features, and that'll help you kind of see through the matrix when you're seeing all this innovation in the JavaScript world. Everybody's, they are different. None of them are bad. All of them have different opinions, but they are trying to solve the same problem, so they're not as different as sort of advertised. And I think if you're going about trying to learn a new one, or the one you have, this, hopefully this conceptual framework will take you a long way. I did set up, in a second here, you'll see at my blog, funnyant.com/jsconf, anybody who signs up tonight to my JavaScript framework crash course, which is similar to the material I've given here, if you're interested in it, I'll give a copy of my book away free to someone who signs up tonight. So go out there and check it out. Obviously, a lot of this conceptual stuff came from my book, The JavaScript Framework Guide. So if you haven't ever checked it out, please do. Feel free to email me with questions or comments. There's my email. And thanks a lot. Did I catch Chuck off guard there?
Almost. You guys can go ahead and hit the Ask a Question button if you want to ask Craig a question. Also, the AngularJS team is up next, so if you guys are in the audience, go ahead and just raise your hand or let me know so we can get you hooked up. Looks like I found Igor in there, so I'll reach out to him. But yeah, looks like Dennis Baskin has a question, so I'm going to give him voice, and I'll start getting things geared up for the next presentation.
Okay. Oh, Dennis, so you're asking a question down in the chat here. I'll repeat it out loud. Have I looked at the Ariella framework? I have not, but I'm interested in it, right? Because so for people who don't know, this is I'll struggle with names, but Rob Eisenberg.
Rob Eisenberg.
Right? From our, among other things, I think in the framework. I'm sure they'll talk about that more next. And he was the original author of the Durandal framework, which had some really innovative type things. I think that's why the Angular team, had him collaborated with him. But he's come out with a new JavaScript MVC framework, and definitely worth looking at. But no, I have not looked at it closely yet, although I can pretty much guess what it's going to look like. No. But yeah, that's definitely something to keep an eye on as far as the newcomers. Okay, so looking for other questions here while Chuck's busy. Let me actually flip over this window. Presentation down. See everybody. That's a little easier for me to read. Okay, so if you ask a question I probably didn't catch it, go ahead and throw them out there again. Craig, in your opinion, how do each of these frameworks compare when it comes to unit testing? Very good question. So, easy answer is Angular probably is the leader, particularly in unit testing, right? Because of its built-in dependency injection. In fact, Tom Dale, who's the creator of Ember, during the famous cage between Angular and Ember that went on one of the conferences, you can Google that if you want to check it out. I think it wasn't quite fair because Rob Connery was, not that Rob Connery's not capable, but was representing Angular, and Tom Dale, who was a part of the core team, was representing Ember. But at the end, they asked an interesting question, which was, what do you admire about the frameworks? And Ember, the Ember brought up, Angular comes out on top in terms of unit testing there. Just really easy to dependency inject, mock things away because of the architecture you've got there. I do think, though, that sometimes dependency injection in a dynamic language is useful, right? And it leads people down the right path, makes things easier to test. But it's not all as hard as some of us make it out to be to unit test stuff in JavaScript, right? Yeah, so that's, I guess, what I'd say about that.
All right. Well, I hate to cut you off, but I'm going to cut you off.
Good, because I don't know anything about EXT.js, and they're asking about that. So.
I have actually used ext.js, and there was way too much ceremony in it for me, but it does get the job done. So if that's your thing, then go for it. All right. Well, everybody give Craig a hand in the chat. And thank you for presenting and sharing with us. Looks like we've got the AngularJS guys all lined up and ready to go. So, whoa, what did I do?